Well now, look who wandered in just before dream time. Welcome, my dear traveler, to the Academy of Sleep. I'm Grandpa Ryan, your humble guide through old stories, quiet wonders, and the kind of history they don't rush to tell you in school. The kind that drifts like sea foam and lingers like a bedtime breeze. Now, before your eyelids start doing that little sleepy dance, why not tap that subscribe button? Go on, do it now. You'll thank yourself in the morning. And then, we'll begin. The Age of Viking Expansion. Raids, Explorations, and Legends, Chapter 1. Introduction. Beyond the Horned Helmet. Who were the Vikings? We journey today into the Viking Age, an era that has seized imaginations for centuries. It began dramatically in 793 A.D. with the raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in Northumbria, an event that shocked Europe and heralded a new formidable force from the north. This age spans roughly from that iconic assault to 1066 A.D., a year marked by pivotal battles like Stamford Bridge, which saw the demise of one of the last great Viking warrior kings, and the Norman conquest of England, led by descendants of Viking settlers. These dates frame nearly 3 centuries of intense Scandinavian activity and its profound global impact. Before we delve deeper, let's dismantle a pervasive myth: the horned helmet. This dramatic image is largely a 19th century fabrication, popularized by Romantic art and opera, with little to no archaeological basis for Viking battle wear. Their helmets were far more practical, designed for protection. Nor were they simply unkempt, filthy barbarians. While their raids were undeniably brutal, archaeological evidence reveals a people concerned with grooming, who were also astute traders, pioneering farmers taming harsh lands, and skilled artisans whose intricate work still awes us. The term Viking itself often described an activity. To go Viking meant to go on an overseas expedition, rather than a single monolithic people. They hailed from various regions of Scandinavia, what we now know as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Our exploration of this complex age will center on 3 interconnected core themes. First, the raids: swift, often brutal, and terrifyingly effective attacks on monasteries and towns that reshaped political landscapes and instilled widespread fear. Second, their extraordinary explorations, powered by unparalleled maritime skill and the revolutionary longship. They ventured across uncharted waters, settling Iceland and Greenland and becoming the first known Europeans to reach North America, which they called Vinland. To the east, they forged vast trade networks down Russian rivers to Byzantium and the Arab world. Third, their rich legends, the vibrant tapestry of Norse mythology, with gods like Odin, Thor, and Loki, and the epic sagas recorded in Iceland, which offer invaluable, if stylized, insights into their worldview, societal values, and heroic ideals. To understand the impetus behind this expansion, we must briefly consider their homeland. Scandinavia's geography: Norway's long, fjord-indented coastline fostering seafaring, Sweden's vast forests and river systems providing resources and eastern access. Denmark's strategic position at the Baltic Gateway played a crucial role. For these peoples, the sea was not a barrier but a highway. This maritime heritage, coupled with internal societal pressures and a spirit of enterprise, set the stage. Their mastery of the sea, embodied in the Longship, was the key that unlocked an age of unprecedented raidings, exploration, and lasting legend. Chapter 2. Before the Storm. Scandinavian Society, on the eve of expansion. To truly understand the forces that propelled the Scandinavian peoples across the seas, we must first look inward, to the societies that existed in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden before the first longships appeared on foreign shores. The Viking Age didn't erupt from a vacuum. It was an evolution, a dramatic outward expression of internal structures, skills, and pressures that had been developing for centuries. Scandinavia, on the eve of expansion, was a complex tapestry of deeply rooted traditions, agricultural rhythms, and an ever-present relationship with the sea. At its core, Scandinavian society was hierarchical, broadly divided into three main classes. At the apex were the jarls, the aristocracy. These were powerful chieftains, wealthy landowners, and military leaders who commanded respect and loyalty through a combination of lineage, accumulated wealth, personal prowess in combat, and the ability to generously reward their followers. Their power was often regional, based on the allegiance of local freemen. Below them, forming the backbone of society, were the carls. This was a broad class of freeborn men, farmers who owned or leased their land, merchants, skilled artisans like blacksmiths and shipwrights, and warriors. They enjoyed legal rights, could bear arms, participate in local assemblies or things, and owed allegiance to a jarl, often in exchange for protection and a share in the spoils of war or successful trade. The status of a carl was not entirely fixed. Success in farming, trade, or raiding could elevate one's standing and wealth. At the bottom of the social ladder were the thralls, or slaves. Thralls were considered property, with no legal rights. They were typically captives of war from other Scandinavian regions, or from raids abroad, or individuals born into slavery. They performed the hardest manual labor, on farms and in households. While their lives were harsh, it wasn't always a permanent condition. Thralls could sometimes be freed by their masters, though upward mobility into the carl class was rare. The foundation of the Scandinavian economy was agriculture. Despite the often challenging northern climate and rugged terrain, especially in Norway, farming was the primary occupation. People lived predominantly in scattered farmsteads or small villages, rather than large urban centers. The longhouse, a characteristic dwelling, often housed an extended family and sometimes their livestock under one roof. They cultivated crops like barley, oats, and rye, and raised cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. Hunting and fishing supplemented their diet and provided valuable resources like furs and hides. While predominantly rural, some important trading centers were emerging, bustling proto-towns like Hedeby in Denmark, Burka in Sweden, and Kaupang in Norway. These nexuses attracted merchants and craftsmen from within Scandinavia and beyond, facilitating the exchange of local goods, furs, amber, iron, whetstones, soapstone vessels, for foreign luxuries like wine, pottery, glass, and silver. This early trade, though not on the scale of the later Viking commercial networks, established vital maritime routes and connections. Central to the Viking mindset, and indeed to pre-Viking Scandinavian society, was an intricate code of honor, kinship, and reputation. Honor, or drengskaper, was paramount. It encompassed courage, loyalty, generosity, keeping one's word, and avenging wrongs done to oneself or one's kin. A man's reputation was his most valuable possession, hard-won, and fiercely defended. Kinship ties were incredibly strong. Loyalty to one's family and chieftain was absolute, and the bonds of blood demanded vengeance if a relative was harmed or killed. This could lead to long-running, bloody feuds between families, a common theme in the later sagas. The desire for a lasting reputation, to be remembered for great deeds and a strong character, was a powerful motivator. This aspiration for posthumous fame fueled heroic acts and a willingness to take risks. Finally, the sea was not a new frontier. In 793 AD, it was an ancient highway. Scandinavians had been accomplished shipbuilders and seafarers for centuries. Archaeological finds like the Nydam boat from Denmark, dating to around 320 AD, demonstrate a sophisticated tradition of clinker-built vessels well before the Viking Age proper. These earlier ships, propelled by oars, were used for fishing, local trade, along the deeply indented coastlines, and probably for smaller-scale raiding between Scandinavian communities. The skills of navigating by landmarks, sun and stars, understanding currents and weather patterns, and constructing robust, seaworthy vessels were deeply ingrained. The environment itself, the long coastlines of Norway, the island nature of Denmark, the lake and river systems of Sweden leading to the Baltic, naturally fostered these maritime skills. It was this existing bedrock of nautical expertise, combined with the societal structures and values we've discussed, that provided the platform from which the revolutionary longship would launch an age of unprecedented expansion. The stage was set, the actors were ready, and the world was about to learn their names. Chapter 3. The Spark. Why did they go Viking? Theories of expansion. The sudden dramatic eruption of Scandinavian peoples onto the European stage in the late 8th century begs a fundamental question. Why? What confluence of factors transformed these northern farmers, traders, and local chieftains into the feared Vikings whose voyages would span continents? There isn't a single, simple answer, but rather a complex interplay of pressures, opportunities, and innovations that ignited the age of expansion. One of the most frequently cited theories points to population pressure and resource scarcity within Scandinavia itself. While the lands were vast, prime arable land, particularly in rugged Norway, was limited. Archaeological and paleoclimatological evidence suggests that the medieval warm period saw a phase of relatively milder climate in the North Atlantic region, roughly corresponding with the Viking Age, may have led to improved agricultural yields and, consequently, population growth. More mouths to feed and more sons seeking land and inheritance in a system that often favored primogeniture, the eldest son inheriting the family farmstead, could have created a significant push factor. Younger sons, or those from less prominent families, faced diminishing prospects at home. For them, the sea offered an alternative path to wealth, status, and land of their own, if they were bold enough to seize it. Hand in hand with demographic shifts were internal political developments. The centuries leading up to the Viking Age saw a gradual, often violent, process of consolidation of power in parts of Scandinavia. Ambitious chieftains and petty kings sought to expand their authority, subjugating weaker neighbors and centralizing control. Harald Fairhair's legendary unification of Norway in the late 9th century is a prime example. Such centralization, while creating more powerful kingdoms, could also displace rival chieftains and their followers. These dispossessed or disgruntled warriors unwilling to submit to a new overlord, might have chosen self-exile, taking their skills and ambitions abroad. For others, the very act of going Viking, leading successful raids, and returning with wealth and prestige, could bolster their political standing back home, enabling them to challenge established rulers or carve out their own spheres of influence. The pull factor was undeniably potent, the allure of wealth and opportunity abroad. To the south and west lay societies that were, in many ways, more developed, wealthier, but also crucially often politically fragmented or poorly defended, especially along their extensive coastlines and navigable rivers. Monasteries, like Lindisfarne, were not just spiritual centers, but also repositories of accumulated wealth, gold and silver religious artifacts, precious manuscripts, and provisions, often with minimal defenses. Towns in England, Francia, and Ireland offered similar temptations. Early, successful raids would have brought back not only tangible riches, but also tales of vulnerable targets, further fueling the desire for adventure and plunder. The Scandinavians were astute observers. They quickly learned where the wealth lay and how to exploit weaknesses. For a young man with little to lose and much to gain, the potential rewards of a successful raiding season far outweighed the risks. Crucially, none of this expansion would have been possible on such a grand scale without a key technological innovation, the longship. While seafaring was an ancient tradition, the Viking longship, which reached its zenith during this period, was a marvel of naval engineering. Its shallow draft allowed it to navigate far up rivers, striking deep inland, and to be beached quickly for surprise landings. Its clinker-built hull was both strong and flexible, capable of weathering fierce Atlantic storms. Powered by both sail and oars, it was swift and maneuverable, giving the Vikings a crucial advantage in speed and surprise over their victims. The longship wasn't the cause of the expansion, but it was the indispensable engine that enabled it, transforming localized raiding into a far-reaching phenomenon. It allowed larger warbands to travel further, faster, and with greater reliability than ever before. Finally, some scholars also point to potential climate factors beyond just agricultural yields. The medieval warm period may not only have boosted populations, but also potentially made sea voyages in the North Atlantic slightly less perilous, with perhaps less severe ice conditions. While harder to quantify precisely, favorable sailing conditions could have played a supporting role in encouraging longer and more ambitious expeditions. Thus, the spark of the Viking Age was lit not by a single flame, but by a combination of these elements: a growing population seeking outlets, ambitious leaders vying for power, the irresistible pull of foreign riches, and the unparalleled technological advantage of their magnificent ships. It was this potent mix that propelled the Northmen outwards, changing the course of European history. Chapter 4. The Longship, Engine of Expansion and Terror. If the Viking Age was a firestorm that swept across Europe and beyond, then the longship was the perfectly engineered bellows that fanned its flames. More than just a vessel, it was a technological masterpiece, a cultural icon, and the very engine that powered the Norse expansion. Without the longship, the Vikings might have remained a localized phenomenon. With it, they became masters of the waves, capable of striking with unprecedented speed and reach, instilling terror and reshaping the maritime world. The genius of the longship lay in its revolutionary design and construction. These vessels were characterized by their long, narrow, and shallow hulls, an elegant and deadly combination. They were predominantly clinker-built, a technique where the hull planks, strakes, overlapped and were fastened together with iron rivets. This method provided remarkable strength, combined with a crucial degree of flexibility, allowing the ship to bend and twist with the waves rather than break under stress during long ocean voyages or rough coastal landings. Oak was the preferred timber for its strength and durability. The shallow draft was perhaps its most significant tactical advantage. While larger contemporary European ships, like the cog, required deep water ports, the longship could navigate shallow rivers, estuaries, and coastlines, enabling the Vikings to penetrate deep inland, far from established coastal defenses, and to land directly on beaches, launching surprise attacks before defenders could muster. Their capabilities were astounding for the era. Longships were propelled by both a large, square woolen sail and banks of oars. The sail, often striped or brightly colored, allowed for rapid travel over long distances when the wind was favorable. When winds failed, or during combat and precise maneuvering close to shore or upriver, the oarsmen provided the power. A typical warship, like the famed Skad, Long Skouth, or Drakar, dragon ship, named for its carved prow, might carry anywhere from 40 to over 100 warriors, who also served as the crew. The ships were light enough to be portaged over land between waterways if necessary. They were fast, capable of reaching speeds estimated at 10 to 15 knots under ideal conditions, allowing them to outrun many contemporary vessels and to appear and disappear with terrifying swiftness. Their versatility was unmatched. They could function as troop transports, raiding vessels, trading ships, and even platforms for exploration into the unknown. Navigation techniques, in an age without magnetic compasses or modern charts, were a sophisticated blend of accumulated knowledge and keen observation. Vikings relied heavily on detailed knowledge of coastlines, currents, and tidal patterns, passed down through generations. They navigated by the sun during the day, and the stars, particularly Polaris, the North Star, at night. The position of the sun at midday could give a rough indication of latitude. There's also intriguing, though debated, evidence for the use of sunstones, possibly calcite crystals like Iceland spar, which could polarize light, theoretically allowing them to locate the sun's position, even on overcast days. Observation of migrating birds, whale routes, wave patterns, water color, and even distant cloud formations over land, all played a part in their remarkable ability to traverse vast open stretches of ocean, like the voyages to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland. Life aboard a longship was far from comfortable. These were open vessels, offering little protection from the elements. The crew, who were also the warriors, slept on deck, likely under animal hides or their cloaks. Provisions, dried fish, meat, hard bread, water, and ale were stored in chests that might also serve as rowing benches. There was little privacy, and conditions were cramped, especially on a fully manned warship. The rhythm of life was dictated by the sea, the wind, and the demands of rowing. Discipline and teamwork were essential. Yet, these harsh conditions forged resilient and formidable crews, bound together by shared purpose and hardship. The psychological impact of the Longship on those who witnessed its arrival cannot be overstated. For the monks of Lindisfarne, or the villagers along the coasts of Francia, the sight of those sleek, dragon-prowed ships suddenly appearing on the horizon, sails billowing or oars flashing in unison, was a harbinger of doom. They materialized as if from nowhere, disgorged their fierce crews, plundered, burned, and then vanished as quickly as they came, often before any effective defense could be organized. The Longship became a symbol of terror, its silhouette synonymous with chaos and destruction. It represented an almost supernatural ability to strike at will, leaving communities in a constant state of fear and uncertainty. This vessel was not merely a tool. It was the key that unlocked the Viking fury upon the world. Chapter 5. From the fury of the Northmen. Good Lord, deliver us. The first wave of raids, circa 793 to 850 AD. The year 793 AD etched itself into the annals of European history with blood and fire. On June 8th, the serene monastic community of Lindisfarne, also known as Holy Island, off the coast of Northumbria in northern England, suffered a brutal and unexpected assault. Longships, those terrifyingly swift vessels we've discussed, materialized from the sea, disgorging a host of fierce warriors. These were Northmen, Vikings, and their attack on this revered center of Christian learning and pilgrimage was an act of unprecedented sacrilege and violence. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records with horror. In this year, fierce, foreboding omens came over the land of the Northumbrians, and the wretched people shook. There were excessive whirlwinds, lightning and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. These signs were followed by great famine, and a little after those, that same year on the 6th Ides of January, the ravaging of wretched heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne through brutal robbery and slaughter. Though the Chronicle gets the date slightly wrong, other sources confirm June. The devastation was undeniable. Monks were killed, others enslaved, and the church plundered of its precious relics and treasures. Alcuin of York, a Northumbrian scholar at Charlemagne's court, lamented, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets." Lindisfarne was not the very first Viking raid. There had been a smaller attack in Dorset a few years prior. But its symbolic importance, its sheer brutality, and the shockwaves it sent through Christendom marked it as the traditional, horrifying dawn of the Viking Age. The characteristics of these early raids, spanning roughly from Lindisfarne to the mid-9th century, followed a discernible pattern. They were predominantly coastal, hit-and-run affairs. Viking warbands, often small to medium in size, would utilize the speed and shallow draft of their longships to make swift, surprise landings. Their targets were typically soft, poorly defended, or unsuspecting coastal settlements, isolated farmsteads, and most famously monasteries. These monastic communities, often situated in remote coastal locations for contemplative seclusion, were rich in portable wealth. Gold and silver chalices, jeweled book covers, reliquaries, and accumulated donations. They were also, critically, usually undefended by any significant military force, their inhabitants being men of peace. The Vikings would strike quickly, seize whatever valuables and captives they could, and then retreat to their ships and the sea before any organized local defense could be mustered. The objective was plunder and slaves, not territorial conquest at this stage. These early Vikings were seasonal marauders, often returning to Scandinavia in the autumn with their loot. The impact of these raids was felt across a wide arc of Western Europe. England, with its numerous wealthy monasteries and fractured Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, was a prime target. Following Lindisfarne, monasteries like Jarrow, also in Northumbria, Iona in Scotland, and sites in Kent and East Anglia suffered repeated attacks. Ireland, with its rich monastic tradition and decentralized political structure of warring petty kingdoms, also became a frequent hunting ground. Irish annals are filled with accounts of churches burned and communities ravaged by the Gentiles, or dark foreigners. Further south, the coasts of Francia, the sprawling Carolingian Empire, soon experienced the Viking fury. By the 830s and 840s, Viking fleets were regularly sailing up major rivers like the Seine, Loire, and Garonne, sacking towns such as Rouen, Nantes, and even threatening Paris. Frisian trading posts like Dorestad, a vital commercial hub, were repeatedly plundered. The Vikings were learning, adapting, and becoming bolder. Their knowledge of European geography and vulnerabilities growing with each successful expedition. The psychological terror these raids inflicted was profound. The suddenness, brutality, and perceived pagan sacrilege of the attackers left communities traumatized. The image of the Viking became synonymous with pitiless destruction. This fear is vividly captured in the famous liturgical prayer, variations of which emerged in churches across Francia. A furore Normanorum, libera nos, Domine, from the fury of the Northmen, good Lord, deliver us. This plea encapsulates the desperation and helplessness felt by many in the face of these seemingly unstoppable seaborne assailants. Contemporary chroniclers depicted them as divine punishment for sins, as demonic agents sent to scourge Christendom. This first wave of attacks was characterized by its shock value. Europe had faced barbarian invasions before, but nothing quite like these maritime predators who could strike anywhere along its vast coastlines and river systems with such terrifying efficiency. This initial phase, lasting roughly 6 decades, laid the groundwork for what was to come. It was a period of reconnaissance, of learning, and of growing ambition. The Northmen were testing the waters, and they found them ripe for the taking. The fury was just beginning to build. Chapter 6. The Great Heathen Army and the Danelaw, Conquest and Settlement in England. The mid-9th century witnessed a significant shift in the nature of Viking activity in England. The era of sporadic, seasonal hit-and-run raids began to evolve into something far more ambitious and menacing. Large-scale invasion, prolonged campaigning, and ultimately, conquest and settlement. The catalyst for this profound change was the arrival of what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle dramatically termed the Mycel Heathen Heer, the Great Heathen Army, in the autumn of 865 AD. This was no mere raiding party. It was a formidable coalition of Viking warbands, possibly numbering several thousand warriors, drawn from various parts of Scandinavia, united under a collective leadership with grander designs than simple plunder. The leadership of this formidable force is shrouded in the mists of legend and saga, but key figures often associated with its campaigns include Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Upa, purported sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, who, according to sagas, sought to avenge their father's death at the hands of King Ella of Northumbria. While the historicity of Ragnar himself is debated, the impact of the army he supposedly inspired is undeniable. Unlike previous Viking forces, the great heathen army did not sail home for the winter. Instead, they overwintered in East Anglia, extorting tribute and horses, effectively establishing a mobile, fortified base from which to launch campaigns deeper into the English kingdoms. Over the next decade and a half, the great heathen army systematically dismantled the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In 866, they marched north and captured York, the capital of Northumbria, exploiting internal divisions within the kingdom. King Ella and his rival Osbert were defeated and killed. Northumbria fell under Viking control. East Anglia, after its king, Edmund, was martyred in 869, allegedly for refusing to renounce Christ, shot with arrows and beheaded, also succumbed. Mercia, one of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, was next. The army pushed deep into its territory, forcing King Burgred into exile in 874 and installing a puppet king, Ceolwulf II. By the mid-870s, only one major Anglo-Saxon kingdom remained standing: Wessex, under the rule of Alfred the Great. The Vikings' initial aim may have been to conquer all of England, but Wessex proved a more resilient foe. After a series of desperate struggles, including Alfred's famous retreat to the marshes of Athelney and his subsequent rallying of forces, he achieved a decisive victory over a Viking army led by Guthrum at the Battle of Edington in 878. This victory was a crucial turning point. Guthrum and his leading warriors were compelled to accept baptism, with Alfred standing as godfather, and a treaty often referred to as the Treaty of Wedmore, though more formally the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, was established. This agreement effectively partitioned England. The Vikings were to withdraw from Wessex, and a boundary was drawn, roughly from London up the River Lea to Bedford, then along the Ouse and Watling Street. The lands to the north and east of this line came to be known as the Danelaw. The establishment of the Danelaw marked a new phase. It wasn't just a zone of Viking military occupation. It became an area of significant Scandinavian settlement and cultural influence. Viking warriors were allotted land, becoming farmers and settlers. Viking laws, customs, language, and social structures took root alongside and often intermingled with existing Anglo-Saxon traditions. Towns like York, Jórvík, Lincoln, Nottingham, Derby, and Leicester became important Viking urban centers known as the Five Boroughs, flourishing as trading hubs within this Scandinavian-dominated territory. The influence is still evident today in place names ending in -by-, village-e.g., Grimsby-, Thorpe-, outlying farmstead-, Scunthorpe-, Thwaite-, clearing-, e.g. Linthwaite-, all of Norse origin, which are common throughout the former Danelaw. Even the English language absorbed hundreds of Old Norse words, including skow, skin, skull, knife, law, window, and even the pronoun they. While Alfred's victory at Edington saved Wessex and laid the foundations for the eventual reconquest of the Danelaw by his successors, the great heathen army had irrevocably changed England. It shattered the old Anglo-Saxon political order, paving the way for a more unified English identity to emerge in opposition to the Viking threat. It also resulted in a lasting Scandinavian demographic and cultural imprint on a significant portion of the country. The Danelaw was not a monolithic Viking kingdom, but a mosaic of territories under various levels of Scandinavian control and influence, a testament to the Vikings' shift from raiders to conquerors and colonizers in England. The fury of the Northmen had found a new, more permanent home. Chapter 7. Beyond England, Viking impact on Ireland, Scotland, and Francia. While the campaigns of the Great Heathen Army and the subsequent establishment of the Danelaw dramatically reshaped England, the Viking impact rippled with equal, though distinct, force across other parts of Western Europe. Ireland, Scotland, and the sprawling lands of Francia each experienced their own unique encounters with the Northmen, ranging from devastating raids and bitter conflict to the establishment of lasting settlements and profound cultural intermingling. In Ireland, Viking activity began contemporaneously with the raids on England, with the first recorded attacks occurring around 795 on islands like Lambay. The numerous, wealthy, and often poorly defended monasteries made Ireland an attractive target. For several decades, the pattern resembled that in England, seasonal raids for plunder and slaves. However, by the 830s and 840s, the Vikings began to establish permanent fortified bases, known as long forts, at strategic coastal and riverine locations. The most significant of these was at the mouth of the River Liffey, which would evolve into the city of Dublin. Other important Viking settlements that grew from these fortified camps include Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, and Cork. These towns became crucial nodes in a vast Viking trading network, connecting Ireland to Scandinavia, England, continental Europe, and even further east. The Vikings in Ireland, often referred to as Norse or Norse Gaels, as intermarriage became common, were not just raiders, but also merchants, craftsmen, and active participants in the complex, shifting alliances and conflicts between Irish provincial kings. While figures like Brian Boru famously defeated a Viking Leinster alliance at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, an event often mythologized as the end of Viking power in Ireland, Viking influence and the distinct Hiberno-Norse culture persisted in these towns for generations, contributing significantly to Ireland's urban development and maritime trade. To the north, Scotland and its surrounding islands also felt the full force of Viking expansion. The northern isles of Orkney and Shetland, geographically close to Norway, were among the earliest areas to be settled, perhaps even before major raids began on the mainland. These islands became thoroughly Norse in culture and language, effectively Scandinavian colonies, and served as important staging posts for Viking voyages further west and south. The Hebrides and the western coast of Scotland also saw significant Norse settlement and the emergence of a mixed Norse-Gaelic culture, evidenced by place names, archaeology, and figures like Somerled, a 12th-century Hebridean lord of mixed Norse-Gaelic descent, who challenged both Scottish and Norwegian rule. Viking raids on the Scottish mainland, particularly targeting Pictish and Gaelic monasteries like Iona, were frequent and devastating. While a unified Viking conquest of mainland Scotland didn't occur in the same way as the Danelaw in England, the constant pressure and interaction played a role in the political transformations of the era, including the eventual unification of Picts and Scots under Kenneth MacAlpin, partly as a response to the shared threat. The earldom of Orkney remained a powerful Norse entity, often paying nominal allegiance to the Norwegian crown well into the late medieval period. Across the Channel, Francia, the vast empire of Charlemagne and his successors presented a tempting target. The Carolingian Empire, though powerful, suffered from internal divisions and succession struggles in the 9th century, which the Vikings skillfully exploited. From the 830s onwards, Viking fleets became an increasingly menacing presence along the coasts and up the major rivers, the Seine, Loire, Rhine, and Garonne. They sacked major trading centers like Dorestad and Quentovic repeatedly, and raided important towns such as Rouen, Nantes, Bordeaux, and Hamburg. The infamous siege of Paris in 885 to 886, though, saw a massive Viking fleet besiege the city for months, only being bought off with a hefty ransom and permission to raid further upriver in Burgundy. While the initial Frankish response was often disorganized, defenses gradually improved, with fortified bridges and local militias. However, one of the most lasting impacts of Viking activity in Francia was the creation of Normandy. In 911, the West Frankish king Charles the Simple, weary of constant raiding, granted a Viking leader named Rollo and his followers lands around the lower Seine estuary in what became the Duchy of Normandy. In return, Rollo and his men were to defend the region against other Viking attacks and convert to Christianity. These Northmen or Normans rapidly assimilated, adopting the Frankish language, which evolved into Norman French, and Christian religion, yet retaining their formidable martial prowess and adventurous spirit. A century and a half later, their descendants, under William the Conqueror, would launch their own famous invasion across the Channel, profoundly altering the course of English history. Thus, from the bustling port towns of Ireland to the windswept islands of Scotland and the newly forged Duchy of Normandy, the Viking impact was transformative. They were not simply a destructive force. They were also catalysts for change, town builders, traders, and settlers who became integral parts of the societies they initially terrorized, leaving behind a complex legacy of conflict, coexistence, and cultural fusion. Chapter 8. The Eastern Way. Vikings in the Baltic, Russia, and Byzantium. The Varangians. While the image of Vikings sailing west to raid and settle in Britain, Ireland, and France dominates popular imagination, an equally significant, though often less emphasized, sphere of Viking activity unfolded to the east. Here, across the Baltic Sea, and down the vast network of Eastern European rivers, Scandinavians, often referred to in these regions as Russ or Varangians, forged extensive trade routes, established powerful settlements, and even played a foundational role in the emergence of early Russian states, ultimately reaching the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople. The eastern expansion was driven less by pure plunder, though that certainly occurred, and more by the pursuit of lucrative trade opportunities. The Baltic Sea served as the gateway. From trading posts like Birka in Sweden and Hedeby in Denmark, Scandinavian merchants and warrior adventurers ventured eastward. They sought valuable commodities unavailable in the West: furs, sable, marten, fox, squirrel, honey, wax, walrus, ivory, and, crucially, slaves captured from Slavic and Finnic tribes. These goods were then traded further south for silver dirhams from the Arab caliphates, Byzantine silks, glassware, spices, and wine. Archaeological finds across Scandinavia, particularly hoards of Arab silver coins, attest to the immense scale and profitability of this Eastern trade. The key to unlocking the interior of Eastern Europe lay in its great river systems, the Volga, which flowed south to the Caspian Sea, providing access to Persia and Central Asia, and the Dnieper, which led south to the Black Sea and the Byzantine Empire. The Scandinavians, with their shallow draft longships, capable of being portaged between river systems, a practice known as volok, were uniquely equipped to exploit these waterways. They established fortified settlements along these routes, which served as trading posts, collection points for tribute, and buoys for further exploration. Important early centers included Staraya Ladoga, Aldik Juborg in Old Norse, near Lake Ladoga, and later Novgorod and Kyiv. The term ruse itself is of contentious origin, but many scholars believe it derives from an Old Norse word related to rowing, or a term used by Finnic peoples to describe Swedes. According to the Russian Primary Chronicle, compiled centuries later, Slavic and Finnic tribes, weary of internal conflict, invited Varangian Rus's chieftains, traditionally Rurik and his brothers, to rule over them in the mid-9th century. While the Chronicle's account is likely a later simplification, it reflects a historical reality. Scandinavian warrior merchants did establish themselves as a ruling elite over predominantly Slavic populations in these regions. They organized trade, collected tribute, often in furs, and provided military protection, gradually forming the nucleus of early East Slavic principalities. The Kievan Rus, centered on Kiev, emerged as a particularly powerful and prosperous state, deeply involved in trade with Byzantium. The ultimate prize for many Varangians lay at the southern end of the Dnieper road, Constantinople, Miklagaard, the great city, to the Norse. The wealth, sophistication, and power of the Byzantine Empire were legendary. While the Rus launched several naval attacks on Constantinople, notably in 860, 907, and 941, they also established important commercial treaties with the Byzantines. Perhaps the most famous role played by Scandinavians in Byzantium was that of the Varangian Guard. This elite mercenary unit, formally established in the late 10th century, but drawing on earlier traditions of Norsemen serving the emperor, became the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors. Renowned for their loyalty, bought at a high price, ferocity in battle, and impressive stature, the Varangian Guard attracted warriors from across Scandinavia, including figures like Harald Hardrada, who amassed a fortune serving in the Guard before returning to become King of Norway. Service in the Varangian Guard was a path to immense wealth and prestige. The interactions in the East were complex. While there was undoubtedly conflict and exploitation, particularly in the early stages of establishing control and extracting tribute, there was also significant cultural exchange and assimilation. The Rus elite gradually adopted Slavic language and customs, and by the late 10th century, under figures like Vladimir the Great of Kiev, converted to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, a pivotal moment that profoundly shaped the future religious and cultural identity of Russia. The Eastern Way, therefore, was not merely a sideshow to the Western raids. It was a vast enterprise of exploration, trade, state building, and military service that connected Scandinavia to the heartlands of Eurasia, leaving a lasting legacy on the political and cultural map of Eastern Europe and forging a direct, if sometimes turbulent, link with the opulent world of Byzantium. Chapter 9. Westward Ho. The settlement of Iceland and Greenland. While some Vikings pushed east into the riverlands of Russia and others raided and settled the coasts of Western Europe, a particularly adventurous and hardy group turned their prows west into the vast, often stormy, and largely unknown expanses of the North Atlantic. This westward impulse led to one of the most remarkable achievements of the Viking Age: the discovery, colonization, and establishment of unique societies in Iceland and Greenland, pushing the boundaries of the European world to its very edge. The discovery and settlement of Iceland began in the latter half of the 9th century, traditionally dated from around 870 to 874 AD. According to a medieval Icelandic account known as the Book of Settlements, Norse sailors, possibly blown off course on their way to the Faroe Islands, which had been settled by Norsemen earlier, sighted a large uninhabited island. The first permanent settler is traditionally named as Ingólfur Arnarson, who established his homestead at Reykjavik, the site of Iceland's modern capital. What followed was a significant wave of migration, primarily from Norway, but also including Norse settlers from Viking colonies in the British Isles, sometimes bringing with them Gaelic slaves or spouses. The reasons for this exodus were varied. Some sought to escape the growing power and taxation of King Harald Fairhair in Norway. Others were drawn by the prospect of free land in a place untouched by previous settlement, and some undoubtedly sought adventure and the chance to build a new life. Iceland, though volcanic and possessing a challenging climate, offered fertile valleys suitable for grazing sheep and cattle, abundant fishing, and a sense of freedom from established royal authority. The society that developed in Iceland was unique. Lacking a native population to conquer or interact with, the settlers established a new social and political order from scratch. This culminated in the formation of the Icelandic Commonwealth around the year 930 AD, with the establishment of their General Assembly at a place known as the Assembly Plains. This General Assembly was an annual meeting of chieftains and free farmers, making it one of the oldest parliamentary institutions in the world. It was a place where laws were made and recited by the law speaker, disputes were settled, and social and commercial ties were reinforced. There was no king or centralized executive power. Authority was decentralized, resting with the chieftains who represented the free farmers within their districts. This system, while often prone to feuds and internal strife, vividly depicted in the Icelandic historical tales, endured for over 3 centuries. The Icelanders also developed a rich literary tradition, preserving the Old Norse language and committing to parchment their epic poems and stories that are our primary sources for much of Norse mythology and Viking history. Further west lay an even more formidable land, Greenland. According to the stories, Greenland was discovered by Gunnbjörn Ulfason when his ship was blown off course. However, it was Eric the Red who spearheaded its exploration. Banished from Iceland around the year 982 for manslaughter, Eric sailed west and spent 3 years exploring the southwestern coast of this vast ice-capped island. He found fjords with surprisingly green pastures, at least during the summer months, suitable for farming. Upon his return to Iceland, he astutely named the new land Greenland, arguing that men would be more eager to go there if the land had a good name. Around 985 to 986 AD, Eric led a fleet of colonists, founding 2 main settlements, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, located in sheltered fjords along the southwestern coast. Life on the edge of the known world in Greenland was incredibly challenging. The climate was harsher than Iceland's, the growing season shorter, and farmable land even more limited. The Norse Greenlanders relied heavily on pastoral farming, sheep, goats, some cattle, supplemented by hunting caribou, seals, and walruses. Walrus ivory and hides became valuable export commodities, traded back to Iceland and Europe for essentials like iron, timber, which was scarce in Greenland, and grain. They maintained their Norse culture, laws, and, after the conversion around the year 1000 AD, their Christian faith, even having their own bishop's seat at Gardar. For several centuries, these remote communities clung to existence, a testament to human resilience and adaptability. However, a combination of factors, including a cooling climate, the onset of the Little Ice Age, declining trade with Europe, possible conflicts with the indigenous Inuit, and perhaps an unwillingness or inability to fully adapt their farming practices to the deteriorating conditions, led to the eventual decline and mysterious disappearance of the Norse Greenland settlements by the late 15th or early 16th century. The settlement of Iceland and Greenland represents the furthest extent of sustained European medieval colonization. It showcases the Vikings not just as raiders, but as pioneering explorers and settlers, capable of establishing viable societies in some of the most marginal environments on Earth, driven by a spirit of independence and an unquenchable thirst for new horizons. Chapter 10. To Vinland and Beyond. The American Sagas and the Archaeological Evidence. The westward impulse that led to the settlement of Iceland and Greenland did not stop there. The most audacious, and for centuries, the most debated chapter of Viking exploration concerns their voyages even further west, across the Davis Strait to the shores of North America. 2 remarkable Icelandic texts, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, collectively known as the Vinland Sagas, recount these pioneering expeditions, describing lands they named Helluland, Markland, and most famously Vinland. According to the Sagas, the first European sighting of North America was by a Norseman named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who was blown off course around year 986 while sailing from Iceland to join his father in Greenland. He sighted unknown lands to the west, but did not go ashore. Intrigued by Bjarni's reports, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, purchased Bjarni's ship and around the year 1000 set out to explore these new territories. Leif is credited with making the first purposeful landing. He first encountered a land of flat stones and glaciers, which he named Helluland, Stone Slab Land, likely corresponding to modern Baffin Island. Sailing south, He came to a forested land with white sandy beaches, which he called Markland, forest land, probably the coast of Labrador. Continuing south, he and his crew eventually found a region with a milder climate, abundant salmon in the rivers, and most notably, wild grapes growing, leading Leif to name it Vinland, wineland, or pasture land. The etymology is debated. Here, they established a temporary settlement, Leif's Booths, and overwintered before returning to Greenland with timber and tales of this bountiful new world. Following Leif's voyage, the sagas describe several other expeditions to Vinland, involving his brothers Thorvald and Thorstein, his sister Freydis, and an Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefnio, who led a more ambitious attempt at permanent colonization, bringing livestock and women. These accounts detail explorations along the coast, the construction of more substantial dwellings, and, crucially, interactions with the indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skrællingar, a somewhat derogatory term, possibly meaning screamers or wearers of skins. Initial encounters were sometimes peaceful, involving trade, the Norse offering cloth and milk products for furs, but they soon devolved into hostility and conflict. The sagas recount skirmishes where Norsemen, despite their iron weapons, were outnumbered and intimidated by the Skrællingar's numbers and fighting techniques. Thorvald Eriksson is said to have been killed by an arrow in one such encounter. For centuries, the Vinland sagas were largely regarded by many outside Scandinavia as folklore or romanticized legends. The idea of Vikings reaching America 5 centuries before Columbus seemed incredible. However, in the 1960s, the narrative took a dramatic turn, with the archaeological discoveries at L'Anse aux Meadows, located at the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada. Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Stein Ingstad excavated the remains of a Norse settlement, unequivocally dating to around year 1000. The site included foundations of several turf-walled longhouses, identical in construction to those found in Norse Greenland and Iceland, a smithy with evidence of ironworking, a technology unknown to indigenous peoples of the region at that time, a carpentry workshop, and various Norse artifacts, including a bronze ring-headed pin and a soapstone spindle whorl used for spinning wool, indicating the presence of women. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the site's age, aligning perfectly with the time frame of the Vinland voyages described in the sagas. L'Anse aux Meadows provided the first irrefutable physical proof of a Norse presence in North America. The question then arises, why didn't the Norse settlements in Vinland last? The sagas themselves offer clues. The small number of Norse settlers, probably never more than a few hundred at any given time, faced a vast continent inhabited by indigenous populations who ultimately proved hostile. The great distance from Greenland and Iceland made resupply and reinforcement incredibly difficult. Internal disputes among the Norse leaders, as hinted at in the sagas, particularly concerning Freydis, may also have weakened their resolve. Unlike Iceland and Greenland, Vinland was not uninhabited. The Skrællingar were well adapted to their environment, and despite lacking metal weapons, possessed superior numbers and local knowledge. Ultimately, the Norse seem to have concluded that the benefits of Vinland, primarily timber, which was scarce in Greenland, were outweighed by the dangers and difficulties of maintaining a permanent foothold so far from home, in the face of sustained indigenous resistance. while sporadic voyages for resources like timber may have continued for some time. The dream of a lasting Norse colony in the New World faded. Longso Meadows was likely a base camp, a gateway for further exploration and resource gathering, rather than a long-term settlement itself. The Vinland voyages, though ultimately fleeting in terms of permanent colonization, remain a testament to the extraordinary reach and daring of Viking seafarers. They represent the westernmost extent of their explorations, a remarkable, if temporary, European presence on the American continent, achieved centuries before the more widely recognized Age of Discovery. Chapter 11. Gods, Giants, and Heroes, Norse Mythology and Beliefs. To truly comprehend the Viking mindset, their motivations, and their often fearless approach to a harsh and dangerous world, we must delve into their spiritual landscape. The rich, complex, and often brutal world of Norse mythology. This was not a formalized religion with a single holy book or centralized priesthood in the way we might understand it today, but rather a collection of beliefs, rituals, and stories that shaped their understanding of the universe, their place within it, and the forces that governed their lives and destinies. Our primary sources for this mythology are a collection of old anonymous poems and a later prose work written by the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, supplemented by the poetry of court poets, inscribed stones, and archaeological finds. At the heart of Norse mythology was a vibrant collection of Norse gods, populated by a host of powerful and often very human-like gods and goddesses known collectively as the Aesir, primarily warrior gods residing in Asgard, and the Vanir, associated with fertility, wisdom, and the ability to see the future, who eventually integrated with the Aesir after a war. Odin, the All-Father, chief of the Aesir, a complex and often contradictory figure. Odin was the god of wisdom, poetry, death, divination, and magic. He famously sacrificed an eye for a drink from Mimir's well to gain cosmic knowledge and hung himself from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights to discover the runes. He presided over Valhalla, the hall where warriors slain bravely in battle feasted and prepared for Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods. His animal companions were the wolves Geri and Freki, and the ravens Hugin, Thought, and Munin, Memory, who flew across the world bringing him news. Thor, god of thunder, lightning, storms, strength, and the protection of humankind. Son of Odin and Jord, Earth, Thor was immensely strong, armed with his mighty hammer Mjolnir, which returned to his hand when thrown, his belt of strength and iron gloves. He was a popular, straightforward champion, constantly battling giants, the enemies of the gods. Freya, a prominent Vanir goddess, associated with love, beauty, fertility, physical desire, war, and a form of magic. She rode a chariot pulled by cats and possessed a famed necklace. Half of those slain in battle went to her hall. Folkvanger, Loki, a cunning and mischievous trickster figure, a giant by birth, but an adopted brother of Odin. Loki was an agent of chaos, sometimes aiding the gods, other times causing immense trouble, his schemes ultimately leading to the death of Balder and contributing to the onset of Ragnarök. He was a shape-shifter and the father of monstrous offspring, including the wolf Fenrir, the Midgard serpent Jormungandr, and Hel, the ruler of the realm of the dead, which shared her name. Other important deities included Frigg, Odin's wife, goddess of marriage and foresight; Tyr, god of war and justice, who sacrificed his hand to bind Fenrir; Heimdall, guardian of the Bifrost Bridge to Asgard; and Balder, the beautiful, beloved god, whose death signaled the beginning of the end. The Norse universe was envisioned as the 9 worlds, all interconnected and supported by the immense ash tree Yggdrasil. These worlds included Asgard, home of the Aesir; Midgard, Middle-earth, home of humans; Jotunheim, home of the giants; Alfheim, home of the light elves; Svartalfheim, home of the dark elves or dwarves; Niflheim, a primordial world of ice and mist; Muspelheim, a primordial world of fire; Hel, the realm of the dishonorable dead, ruled by Loki's daughter of the same name; and Vanaheim, home of the Vanir. Creation myths told of a beginning from a great void, where fire from Muspelheim and ice from Niflheim met, creating the primeval giant Ymir and the cosmic cow, Audumla. Odin and his brothers Vili and Vea slew Ymir and formed the world from his body. Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods, or doom of the powers, was the prophesied apocalyptic end of this cosmic cycle. It involved a series of cataclysmic events, including a great winter, the breaking of bonds, Fenrir and Loki would be loosed, and a final devastating battle between the gods and the giants on the plain of Vigrid. Most major gods, including Odin, Thor, Frey, Tyr, and Heimdall, would perish, as would their adversaries Loki and Fenrir. The world would be consumed by fire and sink into the sea. But a new green earth would eventually re-emerge, populated by a few surviving gods and 2 human survivors, Lif and Lifthrasir, who would repopulate the world. Rituals, sacrifices, and burial practices were integral to Norse religious life. Sacrifices, often of animals, and in rarer, more controversial accounts, humans, were made to appease the gods or gain their favor, typically at seasonal festivals. Burials ranged from simple internments or cremations to elaborate ship burials for high-status individuals like those found at Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway, interred with grave goods intended for the afterlife. A powerful concept woven through Norse belief was fate. While individuals had agency, the ultimate destiny of gods and mortals alike was believed to be preordained by the Norns, 3 female beings who spun the threads of fate at the foot of Yggdrasil. This belief in an inescapable destiny may have contributed to the Viking warriors' famed courage in the face of death. If one's time was set, one might as well meet it bravely. Norse mythology provided a framework for understanding the world, its origins, its end, and the often unpredictable forces that influenced human existence, reflecting the harsh realities and heroic ideals of the Viking Age. Chapter 12. The Sagas, History, Legend, and Literature of the North. Our understanding of the Viking Age, its personalities, conflicts, voyages, and societal norms, is profoundly enriched by a unique body of literature known as the Sagas. Composed primarily in Iceland between the 12th and 14th centuries, centuries after many of the events they describe, these prose narratives represent one of the great literary achievements of the Middle Ages. They offer an unparalleled, if complex and sometimes challenging, window into the Norse world, blending historical accounts with legendary embellishments, keen psychological insight, with stark portrayals of violence and heroism. What are the sagas? The word saga itself comes from an Old Norse verb meaning to say or to tell. and simply means story or narrative. They are a diverse collection, generally categorized into several types: Icelandic sagas, or sagas of Icelanders family sagas. These are perhaps the most famous and widely read. They focus on the lives and feuds of prominent Icelandic families during the settlement period, roughly 9th to 11th centuries. They are characterized by their realistic, concise prose, complex characters, and dramatic plots often revolving around issues of honor, law, kinship, and revenge. Examples include Njal's Saga, Egil's Saga, Laxdæla Saga, and Gretti's Saga. Kings' sagas. These recount the lives of Norwegian kings, and sometimes Danish or Swedish rulers, often in a more overtly historical, though still interpretative style. Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla is the preeminent example, a monumental work chronicling the rulers of Norway from legendary beginnings up to the 12th century. Legendary sagas, also known as sagas of ancient times of the northern lands. These deal with more remote, often mythical or heroic pasts, featuring legendary heroes like Ragnar Lothbrok or Sigurd the Dragon Slayer from the Volsung cycle. They are generally more fantastical and less concerned with historical accuracy than the Icelandic sagas or kings' sagas, often incorporating elements of myth and folklore. Other categories include sagas of bishops, contemporary sagas, like the Sturlunga Saga, detailing events in Iceland closer to the time of writing, and translated tales of chivalry. A crucial question when approaching the sagas is their value as historical sources versus literary creations. For a long time, particularly in the 19th century, they were often taken as largely factual accounts. However, modern scholarship recognizes that, while they undoubtedly contain kernels of historical truth, preserved through oral tradition before being written down, they are also literary constructs shaped by the author's perspectives, artistic choices, and the cultural context of 13th and 14th century Iceland. Authors selected, embellished, and structured their narratives for dramatic effect and to explore particular themes. They are not objective historical documents in the modern sense. Nevertheless, they provide invaluable insights into the social structures, legal systems, manorial culture, mentalities, and values of the Viking Age that are often absent from external contemporary accounts, which typically portray Vikings solely as raiders. The sagas offer an inside view, albeit one filtered through time and literary artifice. The themes explored in the sagas are rich and enduring. Feuds are a dominant motif, meticulously detailing the cycles of insult, injury, and vengeance that could escalate between families over generations, often driven by the uncompromising demands of honor. A concept of honor itself is central, defining a man's worth through courage, loyalty, generosity, and adherence to social codes. Exploration and adventure feature prominently, particularly in sagas, like the Saga of the Greenlanders and Eric the Red's Saga, which recount the voyages to Greenland and Vinland. The lives of famous Viking heroes, some historical, some legendary, are celebrated, showcasing their martial prowess, cunning, or poetic skill. The sagas also delve into the complexities of law and justice, the importance of kinship, the role of women, who are often portrayed as strong-willed and influential figures, and the gradual transition from paganism to Christianity. Key examples illustrate their narrative power. Njal's Saga is considered by many the pinnacle of saga literature, a sprawling epic of friendship, law, prophecy, and escalating feuds, culminating in the tragic burning of Njal and his family. Egil's saga tells the story of Egil Skallagrimsson, a complex and volatile Viking warrior, poet, and sorcerer, chronicling his adventures, his service to kings, his feuds, and his powerful, often deeply personal poetry. The Saga of the Greenlanders and Eric the Red's saga, as mentioned, provide the primary narrative accounts of the Norse discovery and attempted settlement of North America. The sagas were written in Old Icelandic, a language closely related to Old Norse, the common language of the Viking world. Their style is often characterized by its understatement, its objective-seeming narration, even when describing dramatic events, its focus on action and dialogue, and its often stark, unsentimental portrayal of life and death. They are a testament to a vibrant oral storytelling tradition and a sophisticated literary culture that flourished in medieval Iceland, preserving for posterity the voices or imagined voices of the Viking Age. Chapter 13. Viking Warriors, Women and Daily Life. Beyond the stereotype. Beyond the grand narratives of raids, explorations, and mythology, lies the fabric of everyday Viking society. The lives of its warriors, the roles of its women, and the routines of daily existence. Peeling back the layers of stereotype reveals a more nuanced and complex picture than often portrayed, a society with its own distinct customs, skills, and social dynamics. Viking warriors were indeed formidable, their reputation for ferocity well earned. Their primary offensive weapon was the spear, suitable for both thrusting and throwing. The Viking sword, typically a double-edged blade, was a high-status weapon, often beautifully crafted, and a symbol of wealth and rank. Axes, ranging from light, single-handed throwing axes to the fearsome two-handed Dane axe, were also common and devastatingly effective. For defense, warriors carried round wooden shields, often faced with leather and featuring a central iron boss to protect the hand. Mail shirts, burnies, offered significant protection but were expensive and thus likely restricted to wealthier warriors or chieftains. Helmets, as we've noted, were generally simple, conical, or rounded affairs, sometimes with cheek guards or a spectacle guard for the eyes and nose. The iconic shield wall, Skjaldborg, was a key battle tactic where warriors interlocked their shields to form a defensive barrier, presenting a bristling wall of spear points to the enemy. While the image of the berserker, the frenzied warrior who fought with animalistic fury, seemingly impervious to pain, is a powerful one in sagas and popular culture. Their historical reality is debated. They may have been elite warriors who induced a trance-like state through ritual, psychoactive substances, or psychological conditioning, but concrete evidence is scarce. What is clear is that Viking combat was brutal, personal, and often decided by individual prowess within a disciplined group. The roles and rights of women in Viking society were, in many respects, more progressive than in many other contemporary European cultures. While it was a patriarchal society, women were not mere chattels. They could inherit property, own land independently of their husbands, and initiate divorce. A woman brought a dowry into a marriage, which remained her property. Upon her husband's death, she could become the head of the household, managing the farm and finances. Women were responsible for running the household, which was a significant domain involving food production and preservation, textile manufacture, spinning, weaving, sewing, and raising children. While their primary sphere was domestic, there is evidence of women participating in trade, and in rarer, more debated instances, like the shield maidens of legend. Even in warfare, the grave of the Burka female Viking warrior in Sweden, buried with a full set of weapons and gaming pieces indicative of strategic thinking, has fueled this debate. Regardless of their direct participation in combat, women were vital to the economic and social stability of Viking society, and their counsel was often respected. Daily life for most Scandinavians revolved around agriculture and the rhythms of the seasons. Farmsteads, often centered around the longhouse, were the basic unit of society. Craftsmanship was highly valued. Metalworkers produced not only weapons and armor, but also tools, jewelry, brooches, rings, pendants, and household items, often adorned with intricate interlaced patterns characteristic of Viking art. Woodworkers were essential for building ships, houses, carts, and carving elaborate decorative elements. Textile production was a major domestic industry, with women transforming wool and flax into clothing, sails, and tapestries. Trade was increasingly important, not just the long-distance trade of the Russes or the luxury goods sought by raiders, but also local and regional exchange of agricultural surplus, iron, soapstone, whetstones, and other necessities. As the Viking Age progressed, towns like Hedeby, Birka, Ribe, Kaupangs, York, and Dublin grew into bustling centers of craft, commerce, and diverse populations. These towns featured planned streets, specialized workshops, and marketplaces, indicating a sophisticated level of urban organization. Viking art styles, which evolved throughout the period, are another window into their culture. These styles, often categorized as Oseberg, Bora, Yelling, Mammen, Ringerike, and Urnis, are characterized by their intricate animal interlace, gripping beasts, and flowing abstract patterns. They adorned everything from rune stones and picture stones to jewelry, weapons, wooden carvings on ships and sledges, and even everyday objects. This art was not merely decorative. It often carried symbolic meaning, reflecting mythological themes, conveying status, or perhaps serving a patropaic, warding off evil functions. Life in the Viking Age was undoubtedly hard by modern standards, marked by manual labor, seasonal scarcity, and the ever-present possibility of violence or sudden death. Yet, it was also a society with a strong sense of community, a respect for skill and artistry, established legal frameworks, however localized, and a dynamic engagement with the wider world. It was a world far richer and more complex than the one-dimensional stereotype of the bloodthirsty barbarian often suggests. Chapter 14. The Waning of the Age, Conversion, Consolidation, and the End, circa 950 to 1060. The ferocious energy that characterized the early Viking Age, with its dramatic raids and far-flung explorations, could not last indefinitely. From the mid-10th century onwards, a series of profound internal and external changes began to reshape Scandinavian societies and their interactions with the wider world, gradually leading to what historians often term the waning or end of the Viking Age, typically bookended by the symbolic year 1066. One of the most significant transformations was the Christianization of Scandinavia. While Christianity had made inroads earlier, primarily through missionary activity and contact with Christianized populations abroad, the period from the mid-10th to the late 11th century saw its decisive, though often gradual and complex, adoption by the ruling elites and eventually the general populace of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Kings like Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, who famously claimed on the Jelling Stone to have made the Danes Christian around 965, Olaf Tryggvason, and Olaf II Haraldsson, Saint Olaf, of Norway, and Olaf Skutkonung of Sweden played pivotal roles in promoting the new faith, sometimes through persuasion, sometimes through force. The conversion was not merely a spiritual shift. It had profound political, and social implications. It aligned Scandinavian kingdoms more closely with the rest of Christian Europe, facilitating diplomatic and trade relations. It brought literacy through the church, new forms of governance, and a different moral and ethical framework that gradually supplanted or merged with older pagan values. The decline of traditional pagan beliefs and practices also eroded some of the ideological underpinnings of the old Viking way of life, particularly those linked to warrior cults and the pursuit of glory in a pagan afterlife. Simultaneously, Scandinavia itself was undergoing a process of political consolidation and the rise of centralized kingdoms. The era of powerful, independent local chieftains, jarls, gradually gave way to more unified monarchies. In Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, rulers sought to establish greater control over their territories, implement more formalized systems of taxation and law, and build stronger military forces loyal to the crown rather than individual warlords. This internal consolidation reduced the pool of independent warriors and chieftains seeking fortune and adventure abroad through traditional Viking activities. As royal power grew, raiding became less a matter of private enterprise and more an instrument of state policy, or was actively suppressed if it conflicted with the king's interests or diplomatic alliances. Abroad, the assimilation of Vikings into the cultures they had once raided or settled also contributed to the waning of distinct Viking activity. In Normandy, the descendants of Rollo's Norsemen became French-speaking Christian Normans. In the Danelaw in England, generations of intermarriage and cultural exchange blurred the lines between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian. In Ireland, the Hiberno-Norse of the towns became integrated into the Gaelic political and social landscape. In Russia, the Varangian Russ elite merged with the majority Slavic population. While their genetic and cultural legacy endured, the distinct identity of Viking as an external marauding force diminished as these groups became part of the fabric of their new homelands. Furthermore, the societies that had once been vulnerable targets for Viking raids had also adapted. European kingdoms developed more effective defenses, built fortifications, raised standing armies, and learned to counter Viking tactics. The soft targets of the early Viking Age became harder to find and exploit. The balance of military power began to shift. The traditional end date for the Viking Age, year 1066, is marked by two pivotal events. First, the Battle of Stamford Bridge in September, where the English King Harold Godwinson decisively defeated an invading Norwegian army led by King Harald Hardrada, the last Viking. Hardrada's death in this battle is often seen as the end of the line of great Viking warrior kings seeking to conquer foreign lands. Just 3 weeks later, Harold Godwinson himself was defeated and killed at the Battle of Hastings by William, Duke of Normandy. A descendant of Vikings, but now leading a thoroughly Christianized, French-speaking Norman army. The Norman conquest of England ushered in a new era for that country and symbolized a broader shift in European power dynamics. The reasons for the decline of Viking activity were thus multifaceted: Christianization, shifting ideologies, and integration with Christian Europe; political centralization, stronger monarchies in Scandinavia curbed independent raiding; assimilation, Vikings abroad adopted local cultures and identities; improved defenses, European kingdoms became better at repelling attacks; changing economic incentives. As trade routes became more established and secure, legitimate commerce offered a more stable path to wealth than plunder for many. The end of the Viking Age was not an abrupt cessation, but a gradual transformation. The Scandinavians did not disappear; their societies evolved. The adventurous spirit, maritime skills, and commercial acumen honed during the Viking Age continued, but they were now channeled in different directions within the framework of more conventional medieval European states. The age of widespread, independent Viking raiding gave way to a new era of kingdoms, crusades, and burgeoning national identities. Chapter 15. Echoes of the North, the enduring legacy of the Vikings. Though the Viking Age, as a distinct historical period of widespread raiding and expansion, drew to a close around the 11th century, the echoes of the Northmen reverberate powerfully through the centuries, shaping the languages, cultures, landscapes, and even the genetic makeup of Europe and beyond. Their legacy is far more profound and multifaceted than the simple stereotypo of the horned, helmeted plunderer might suggest. The Vikings were not just a passing storm. They were a transformative force whose influence remains palpable today. One of the most immediate and tangible legacies is found in language. The Old Norse spoken by the Vikings left a significant imprint, particularly on English. During the period of the Danelaw, intense contact between Old English speakers and Old Norse speakers led to the incorporation of hundreds of Norse words into the English vocabulary. These are not obscure, archaic terms, but everyday words that are fundamental to modern English. Words like sky, skin, skull, leg, neck, ill, die, anger, awe, berserk, ransack, slaughter, law, husband, fellow, thrive, window, knife, gift, get, give, take, and even pronouns like they, them, and their. The grammatical structure of English was also subtly influenced, becoming more streamlined. Beyond English, Norman French, which itself developed from the Old French spoken in the region settled by Rollo and his Norse followers, carried Viking linguistic traces into the Romance language family, and subsequently, via the Norman conquest, reintroduced some of this Norse influence back into English. The landscape itself bears witness to their presence through place names. Across northern and eastern England, the former Danelaw, northern Scotland, the Isles, Normandy, and areas along the Eastern European river routes, towns, villages, and geographical features retain names of Norse origin. In England, suffixes like by, meaning farmstead, village, as in Grimsby, Derby; thorp, meaning outlying settlement, as in Scunthorpe, Linthorpe; thwaite, meaning clearing, as in Braithwaite; toft, meaning homestead; and killed, meaning spring, are clear indicators of Scandinavian settlement. Similar patterns exist in other regions, providing a linguistic map of Viking migration and influence. Alongside place names, genetic heritage studies have increasingly revealed the extent of Scandinavian ancestry in populations throughout the British Isles, Normandy, and parts of Eastern Europe, a silent testament to the settlers and traders who put down roots in new lands. The image of the Viking underwent a significant romantic revival in the 18th and 19th centuries. Artists, writers, and composers, particularly in Scandinavia and Germany, looked back to the Viking Age as a source of national pride, heroic inspiration, and a perceived pure Germanic past. This period contributed both to a renewed scholarly interest in sagas and mythology, and, unfortunately, to the popularization of some enduring myths, such as the horned helmet. This fascination continued into the 20th and 21st centuries, where Vikings remain a powerful and popular trope in literature, film, television, and gaming, sometimes portrayed with historical nuance, other times as hyper-masculine archetypes. This enduring popular appeal speaks to a persistent fascination with their daring, their perceived freedom, and their dramatic impact on history. More broadly, the Viking Age shaped Europe and beyond in numerous ways. Their establishment of extensive trade routes connected disparate parts of the continent, from the North Atlantic to Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate, fostering economic exchange and cultural diffusion. Their settlements like Dublin, York, and Novgorod grew into significant urban centers. Their political impact was immense. They destabilized existing kingdoms, catalyzed the formation of new ones, like Normandy and the early Rus states, and contributed to the processes of state formation and national identity in places like England and Scotland. Their maritime technology and navigational skills pushed the boundaries of the known world, culminating in the European discovery of North America. So, why do the Vikings still fascinate us centuries later? Perhaps it's the sheer audacity of their ventures, their willingness to brave unknown seas and challenge established powers. Perhaps it's the allure of their rich mythology, with its complex gods and epic tales of heroism and doom. Perhaps it's the image of the fiercely independent individual, unbound by the constraints of more settled societies. Or perhaps it's the recognition that these were not just raiders, but also explorers, traders, settlers, artisans, poets, and lawmakers who left an indelible mark on the world we inhabit today. Their story is a compelling blend of brutality and sophistication, chaos and order, destruction and creation. The echoes of their longships, their battle cries, their sagas and their settlements continue to resonate, reminding us of a dynamic and transformative era that helped to forge the modern world. The age of Viking expansion may have ended, but its legacy endures, a vital and fascinating chapter in the human story. And there you have it, little dreamer, another tale tucked in and told, like a blanket of stars across your mind. If you're still awake, well, bless your stamina. And if you somehow forgot to tap, like, or subscribe earlier, go ahead and do it now, before the dreams pull you under. I'll be right here, waiting in the next story. Until then, sleep well and sail gently.